Thanks very much, Deputy Speaker. And I move the motion relating to ocean conservation in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper. The motion that's in front of the chamber notes that the international community came together on the 5th to the 9th of June of this year in New York to recognise the importance of our oceans. The Australian government, when it appeared at that conservation conference, put on the record what it believed were the achievements from Australia and why Australia should be recognised as a good citizen in terms of protection of the ocean. And you know what they referred to in the contribution that the Australian government made at that committee, at that UN meeting? They referred to protections that were put in place by the previous Labor government when I was Environment Minister that they're now trying to remove. That was the way the Australian government sought to give itself a pat on the back. That's the way the Australian government sought to represent this country to the rest of the world, while not managing to mention to the rest of the world that the Australian government is now actively in a process of removing protection in the ocean. Now, the removal of protections that are now being proposed by this government are no small matter. No small matter at all. At a time when the ocean is under more pressure than ever before, at a time when plastics, pollution, acidification, overfishing are all creating challenges in the ocean beyond what we have experienced before, what does this government decide it's time to do? This government is now engaging, in terms of area, in the largest removal of protected areas in the history of any government on the planet. Let me just say that again. This government, right now, of all the conservation decisions that have ever been made by any government in history, this government, right now, is engaging in the largest removal of areas from conservation ever in history. The areas that they're talking about are areas like the Coral Sea. And as you look at the Coral Sea at a time when to have protection really does matter, you only have to look at what's happening to coral reefs throughout the world to recognise that the health of these areas is of extraordinary importance. Extraordinary importance. And yet, whether it's Osprey Reef, Shark Reef, Bougainville, Marion Reef, as you go up and down Vima Reef, you go through the different lists, there are almost none that escape the cuts that this government is making. Half the areas that have been established as Marine National Park are being proposed to be removed as Marine National Park. And the minister says, oh look, it's not a problem because the boundaries have been kept the same. We're just changing the rules on what you can do inside it. Imagine if we took half the national parks on land and said, look, it's fine, the boundary's still there, you're just allowed to go in now and shoot the native animals. People would understand exactly how offensive and how bizarre that is. But that's exactly what this government is proposing to do with the national parks that have been established in our oceans. Now, national parks in the ocean make a real difference, and we've got proof that they make a real difference. And why do we have proof of that? Because the Howard government did the right thing on this. The Howard government established the zoning in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. The Howard government, quite bravely at the time, and against the views of some of their own membership, put in areas where there would be some areas where no fishing would be allowed at all, and there'd be other areas where sustainable fishing was permitted. And at the time, some people said, well, if you take away our right to fish, it concentrates us in other areas and it means that we'll never get the health. You're better off just spreading it out and letting everything happen everywhere. Well, the science is now in on what the Howard government did. Just take the species of coral trout. Coral trout inside the protected areas of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park have 80% additional biomass to the coral trout in the non-protected areas. An 80% difference in the biomass. It's been established and proven by the Howard government itself that protected areas make a substantive difference in the health of the environment. But this government has decided to break the accord that Australia had observed ever since environmental protection first began. It's not unusual when an area is first put under protection for there to be a political argument about the boundaries, about the level of protection. That happened when Joh Bjelke-Petersen wanted to drill in the Great Barrier Reef. That happened when Bob Hawke was determined to make sure that we saved the Franklin and saved the Daintree and saved Kakadu. Those sorts of arguments have happened at different times. But once it's locked in, it's a lock. Once it's protected, there's been no backward steps. So even when the Fraser government might not have liked some of the decisions that the Whitlam government made, once made, they respected that there would be no backward steps in environmental protection. Even though the Howard government had opposed, at the time that some World Heritage listings were made, had opposed some of the protections that had been put in place by the Hawke and Keating governments, once the Howard government came in, they had a decision of no backward steps. But the Abbott-Turnbull governments are the first governments we have had in this country which have been willing to remove areas from protection. First of all, we saw it with respect to the World Heritage areas in Tasmania, where this government sought to get the World Heritage Committee to take areas out of protection. And the World Heritage Committee dealt with the application in about 3 minutes, with Portugal describing this government's application as feeble, and they threw it out unanimously. But this government has continued now with what they're doing on the oceans. Now, bear in mind, what's happening with the oceans has led to a situation where the Turnbull government is in fact worse on this than the Abbott government was. Because the Abbott government commissioned a review into the marine national parks that I'd put in place. The marine national parks had been put in place under the previous Labor government. And what did the Abbott government review find? I quote, "The expert scientific panel is satisfied that the Marine Bioregional Planning Program, which was based on the Integrated Marine and Coastal Regionalisation of Australia and completed by scientific workshops, peer-reviewed publications and literature reviews, was a sound basis and drew upon the best available information for designing the CMR networks." So after all the claims that those opposite had made that, oh, this wasn't science-based, the Abbott government review came back and said, yes, it was. And then this government decided to gut the protection anyway. Shame. The Coral Sea, which is the cradle for the Great Barrier Reef, the Coral Sea is the area that provides that full, massive, it's magnificent in its own right, and provides that area of buffer zone for the Great Barrier Reef. This government's decisions, if they continue with this, will mean that the longliners will be back. That longlining will happen up and down that area with all the challenges that go with that. And that will be the outcome when they remove this protection. Areas like the Diamantina Fracture Zone, off in the southwest of Western Australia. Areas where we have had some of the deepest water in Australia's oceans, large chunks of it being taken out of protection. We know that protecting these areas makes a quantitative difference to the health of the ocean and the species that live within it. We know the extent to which we rely on the ocean for our industries, not only tourism but also sustainable fishing. They all rely on the oceans being healthy, and we know that their own review said the principles on which these plans were put in place was science-based. And yet this government is now looking at making the largest decision in removing areas from conservation that has ever been undertaken by any country in the world. There's some pretty dodgy countries around the world that have taken areas out of conservation from time to time. It's not a list you want to be on, and it's certainly not a list you want to top. But that is what the Minister for the Environment is currently contemplating doing.
What a disgrace.
My request here is simple: get back to the consensus. Get back to the consensus which has existed throughout the Howard government, throughout the Fraser government, that has been here for generations in Australia, which says once an area is protected, there will be no backward steps. A process of protection that began under Keating, continued under Howard and was concluded in the last Labor government is now potentially being gutted by this government. I'll tell you what, next generations will not thank this mob for wrecking the health of pristine areas of the ocean.